I want to talk about warm banks and whether they are up and running now. They've even popped up on the Archers, you know. I want you to tell me if you go to one. I don't know how to ask these questions because I don't want to live in a world where these questions exist. But given the conversation we had in the last hour and given how many members of the current political class, the current government, the current conservative government describe themselves as Christians, it's the perfect illustration of what we were trying to describe in the last hour, that this country is now a place where warm banks apparently proliferate. Warm banks, a place you go to if you're cold. What Polly Toynbee reminds us of in her introduction is that there have always been places that some people went to if they were cold. A library, most obviously. You'd often see, in my local library growing up, there'd often be a chap there who I think was a knight of the road, as we used to say, who would sit with a newspaper and fall asleep with a newspaper in his lap, and no doubt just taking shelter, taking refuge from a life on the road. I can't believe it. But here we are, living in a country where warm banks exist. So I want to know about the reality of them. If you work in one or if you go to one, then give us a call on 0345 60 60973. All right? How do we get a handle on how big they are, how common they are? How do we get a handle on how commonplace they are? I honestly don't know. But I want to talk about more as well. I don't want the conversation to be confined to people who are using the service, although I would really like you to ring me if you are. I kind of sense that there's a mountain we need to climb together here. We need to make sense of the fact that they exist. I think you'd have to now be particularly wealthy not to be noticing the energy bills, not to be noticing how much you're paying a month. And therefore it becomes very easy to understand people who can't get warm. I know there's always a little bit of callousness involved in conversations like this. There's always a little bit of... And I'm very generous. I try to be very generous. I think, oddly, this is probably a consequence of my Christian upbringing. I always look for a charitable rationale sometimes for uncharitable behaviour. I don't think you should overdo it, because that way you excuse all manner of horribleness. But I do think that often when people are talking about... often when people come across as having very little sympathy for others, they're trying to persuade themselves that they're not vulnerable. Do you see what I mean by that? So, if you say, well, you can eat for... I mean, some people are just horrible. That 30p Lee character talking about being able to eat for 30... Well, that's why he's got his nickname 30p Lee, isn't it? They almost seem to revel in their unpleasantness. But for others, it's almost a protection mechanism that we deploy in order to subconsciously persuade ourselves that we're not vulnerable. So here's somebody hungry over there. Oh yeah, well, if they ate porridge, they wouldn't be hungry. Maybe I'm being too kind, actually. There are more gits out there than perhaps we realise. But generally, or we could sit with a blanket. You get people on social media saying, when I was a kid, we had ice on the inside of the windows and my mum went out to work all day and we only had meat on Sunday. And you're just like, well, what's the point then of progress? What's the point of trying to make things better? If you're harking back to when I was a kid, I had rickets. So why are we giving kids we had scurvy. So why on earth are we giving these kids oranges? Oranges? What do they need oranges for? We had scurvy when I was a kid. It didn't do me any harm. I mean, it is ridiculous, right? Absolutely ridiculous. But it's not a self-protection mechanism sometimes. Sometimes it is actually just a sort of weird, vicious impulse. So I'd like to talk about that as well. I'd like to talk about the denial of suffering. I'd like to talk about the fact that if I talk about food banks or warm banks, and we will talk about both in this hour, that there is a sort of Daily Mail-shaped section of society who are desperate to claim and possibly to believe, but they're certainly desperate to claim that nobody really needs them.